afternoon. My name is Peggy Chang. I'm the Associate Dean of the College and Director of the Curricular Resource Center. Thank you so much for coming to our very first roundtable for Theories in Action, the Senior Exchange 2017. We have over 65 students participating in this event throughout the next few days. We have 11 roundtables, pretty much one on each day for the rest of the week. My dear colleague Kelly Garrett will be facilitating this first roundtable called Imagining Identities in Movement. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Kelly.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. As Peggy said, my name is Kelly Garrett. I'm the program director of the LGBTQ Center, and I've been at Brown for 13 years. And I'm really happy today to be here facilitating this great panel. And they've done a really great job of organizing themselves. So I'll start with having them introduce themselves briefly, and then they can start with their presentations.
Hi, I'm Laura, or Laura, if you can roll your R's, and I am a senior majoring in comparative literature. I was born in Mayagüez, Puerto Rico, and then moved to Boulder, Colorado when I was 5. And you'll see maybe how those identities inform my work in a little bit, and I use she, her, hers pronouns.
My name is Noah Fields, and I'm from California. And I am a senior concentrating in literary arts and gender and sexuality studies. And my pronouns are he, him, his, or they, them, their.
Hey, I'm Sam. My pronouns are also he, him, his. I'm from Long Island, New York. I'm concentrating in ethnic studies. Writing is really important to me, as is multiracial identity. Both of those are pretty relevant to this project.
Hi, I'm Stefania. I'm a senior studying literary arts and ethnic studies. I'm from Chicago, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
I'm Sofia. I'm a junior, actually, so on a structural level, people think I'm a senior, and I use she, her, her pronouns. I'm studying Africana and ethnic studies, and I'm from Brooklyn, New York.
Okay, great. And also, I use she, her, hers pronouns. All right, so let's get started.
I'll get to the podium in a minute. All right. So I wrote a thesis in comparative literature called From El Barrio to La Banlieue, Fictions of Identity in Nuyorican and Beur Literature. So I guess I'll start off by just defining a few terms before talking about why I chose this project. So El Barrio, if you don't know, is part of East Harlem in New York. It's also just the Spanish term for neighborhood. And La Banlieue is this periphery around the city in Paris is where I sort of focus, but it also applies to, it's just the French word for suburbs. And the text I look at the Parisian and the banlieue in Lyon as well, which is another large city in France. And Nuyorican are Puerto Ricans who live in New York or were born in New York or something related to New York and Puerto Rican identity. It's a very complicated relationship, and it's something that I try to define to different degrees in my work. And Beur are second-generation North African migrants in France. And my work focuses on second-generation Algerian migrants specifically. So for my thesis, I looked at 4 novels, which are Down These Mean Streets by Piri Thomas, Azuz Begag's Le Gon du Chabat, which means Shantytown Kid, and it was recently turned into a movie, so there's a really cute cover. When the Spirits Dance Mambo by Marta Moreno Vega, and La Seine était rouge by Leila Sebar, which means When the Seine was red, R-E-D, red. And so these 2 Nuyorican texts are roughly contemporaneous, as well as the two French texts. So I guess I first approached this because I was really interested in how these second generation individuals. I think a lot of us are probably in this room are second generation, and I wanted to be as broad as possible with that term. So what it means in this work is their parents migrated to this new country, and these kids really grew up in this country that wasn't where their parents grew up in, is sort of how I'm defining second generation. And how these individuals have to construct subjectivities for themselves that are defined by liminality. So I compared the French text with the Nuyorican text across gender lines. So that means that I looked at Piri Thomas with Azuz Begag and Moreno Vega with Leila Sebah. And so that allowed me to look interestingly at how gender and language are working as meta-languages for race and space. So in the first chapter where I look at Piri Thomas and Azuz Begag, I am looking at specifically how these authors use the Bildungsroman genre, so the coming-of-age novel, to emphasize how male subjects are trying to construct identities for themselves within a broader social structure. So I think they use language and race primarily to create different spaces in these communities that were not their parents' home communities necessarily. And these novels offer myriad definitions of success and sort of like the cost at which success may come. So are they successfully passing is something that I'm looking at. Is passing something that's worth the cost? Beyond this, in my second chapter, when I look at female authored text, I look at how these female subjects are used to preserve the identity of the parents' homeland in this new country. So I look at how female bodies are territorialized in order to construct sites of cultural memory. And this is really interesting because this is interesting to me because I saw the way that migrants in these new countries don't have a lot of sites of cultural memory. And as we look at histories of violence and how histories are erased when these migrant communities move to a new country, it's interesting that the female author texts are focusing so much on memory. So while I saw that these male author texts were focused so much on the individual development of these male protagonists, the female author texts, these female subjects were really forced to look backwards, look at their parents' histories, look at their collective histories in order to construct cohesive identities of the self. Furthermore, I think that these novels, as literary projects of the individual authors, become sort of corrective texts of history. So these are novels that are increasingly present maybe in syllabi, especially as we look at concentrations like ethnic studies and literary studies. But it was really important for me to look at how these texts can work beyond the categories that we normally put them in. So beyond just being maybe a Latino cultural studies class, how do these novels work within broader literary genres like Bildungsroman to sort of incorporate these subjectivities that have been on the margins into a more central framework? And I think that's something that the city also really is useful in looking at, because cities emphasize the center margin framework that is also being experienced by these subjectivities. So we look a lot at the way that the banlieue is always it's a literal circle sort of around the outer rim of Paris. El Barrio is sort of on the northeast of New York, and there's this funny moment in Moreno Vega's text where someone asks her protagonist, like, where's El Barrio? I've never even heard of that. Is that on Manhattan? And the protagonist is really insulted because she's like, of course it's in Manhattan. So I think using these texts as a way to desubjugate knowledges was really important to me. And I think the other element that came out that was surprising to me was how problematic the question of categories was. So while I'm looking at how race and gender and space specifically are ways that these individual protagonists are trying to defend or contend against categories of identity, my writing this thesis forced me to put these texts into certain categories, and it really emphasized how fictitious all categories are, while Leila Sebar, for instance, is very prominently referred to as like a Beur writer. She has said, I'm an odd choice for that category because I am not really a Beur writer. I am sort of half Algerian, half French, but not wholly either. At the same time, any syllabus on Beur literature will have Leila Sebar on it. So I think the process of writing itself emphasized the fictitiousness of these categories beyond the content that the novels was talking about. And yeah, I think that's where I'll stop. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask later. Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Noah, and my presentation is on my project Writing Nightlife. So I'll start with a question. How is a rave like a writing desk? My project is a hybrid genre investigation of the queer poetics of nightlife, and what I seek to do is to reconcile the seemingly mismatched worlds of poetry and gay clubbing. One appears to be a reflective and passive world, the other a space of disreputable and deeply contested for its hedonism and social transgression. Is this an impossible dance, to make poetry and clubbing speak the same tongue? Okay, let's set the scene. Suppose we have a writing desk walk into a gay club just after midnight. Or perhaps the desk is the dance floor of the club. The books on my writing desk, they commingle, they rub their limbs against each other. Loose sheets of poetry dance against queer theory until a zine cuts in. Colorful post-it notes float on the surfaces of open pages. The whole gang's here, everyone, from Langston Hughes to Eileen Miles, James Schuyler, Samuel Delaney. There's Leslie Feinberg, Manuel Nunes, and there's Ocean Vuong, Marvin K. White, Sophie Meyer. This literary dance floor is an ephemeral archive, long on pleasure and community. Look around at all this queer fabulousness. Fishnets, mascara, combat boots, lame, lipstick-filling stanzas, and dance floors. We converse with one another as if we were not removed by time and space. Let's take an example from Eileen Miles' novel, Chelsea Girls. So she's in this bar, and she's writing poems all over these napkins. She says, I was writing these poems up in the air, really stupid ones, all over these cocktail napkins they give you. God, they were awful. About vitamins and stuff. I was off cigarettes, which always made me particularly insane. Even as we sit at the bar, Eileen Miles won't stop writing her poetry. She improvises with writing, up in the air, like a dancer. Her napkin poems are not intended to be permanently preserved, and we readers will certainly never see them. Instead, they are a kind of continuous, improvised engagement with the stimulating surroundings of the club. Miles invokes writing as a verb, not writing as a noun. Spontaneous and giving no fucks about how it will appear in the morning's light. Spare the hangover for another day. How fabulous and liberating. Just as nightlife is an ephemeral experience and its pleasures are retained only in the memory of its participants, Eileen Miles writes with language and relishes in its temporary immediacy, even while acknowledging that the actual content might be really stupid and not worth preserving at all. Right. Instead of showing us these supposedly awful poems, because Eileen Miles would write awful poetry, right? Eileen Miles preserves for us the pleasure of the process, the motion of the poetry making, the hand gliding across the napkins. We call it writing nightlife because something about the writing changes. The process of notating Nightlife on the page is not merely imitative. Nightlife queers the page. It demands new experiments. We shift towards the ephemeral, embrace the immediacy of stimulation, polyrhythmic sensation, self-invention, fabulousness. We think about space and intimacy. What bodies does this desk hold, and how do they touch? We move closer. Reading and writing, we realize, are fundamentally physical encounters. Somehow, we are dancing together, here, on the same writing desk. Sarah Ahmed's queer phenomenology put the orientation part back into sexual orientation, to think about how bodies are spatially organized in relation to each other. Rather than encountering the physical world or the chambers of history through the straight framework of heteronormativity, the queer eye might look askew through a new angle. Likewise, I contend that queer Nightlife reorients our relationship to the activity of writing, disrupts, dizzies, seduces, intoxicates the poet's thoughts and language. In short, the Poetics of Nightlife queers our perspective of the writing desk and invites us to come at it from another angle. The queer Poetics of Nightlife is larger than life. It is excessive. It commands and rewards attention with pleasure. In the dark, it sets language free. As queer Nightlife continues to be a highly contested space, subject to threats of closure and violence, the project of narrating queer Nightlife proved to be a matter not only of pleasure, but even life and death. In this light, the continuity of queer Nightlife spaces across generations is incredible, bearing its marks of survival, community, resilience, joy, and revolution. It is no coincidence that the Stonewall riots, a critical moment in the mobilization of the gay rights movement, took place in a gay bar. And now let's move into some poetry. I need some volunteers. 4 volunteers. 1. Anyone who's really shy who wants to volunteer? Great. 2. And 2 more people. 3. Come on up. 4. All right, you get this one. You get this one. You get this one. And you get this one. And let's position you as if you're dancing on the dance floor. So let's put you right here. And you can be right here. And do you want to be like over here? Okay. Yeah. And right there is great too. Yeah. Okay. So pretend there's music. Yeah, great. And now, person 2, if you want to read your line.
Ooh, I wish she'd play something familiar. Something I recognize, like Robin. I'm in the corner, watching you kiss her.
Person 3.
Bounce, bounce. Turn around. Oh, shimmy. Pose. 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 And start again.
Person 4.
I swear, man, it's like I'm physically compelled to flail on the beats. I'm like totally in the zone. It's like time disappeared and I can't even discern the edges of the songs anymore.
And person 5.
The only person I ever kissed at a dance party was also the only person I ever kissed.
Give a round of applause to everyone here. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's great. And for the sake of time, I'll just do one more poem. So this poem is from a sort of project that I was doing after the ghost ship fire last December in Oakland, which was like this abandoned warehouse that, well, it wasn't abandoned. A warehouse where there were a lot of particularly queer and trans folks living, and there was a night party, and then there was a fire, and a lot of people perished in that fire, unfortunately, including a Brown alum. So I created like this zine to sort of think about and memorialize dance floors and thinking about the mourning part of the dance party as well as the joy. Breath beckoning sideways through window panes, riding nebulas of yellow heat and purple laughter, exiting private space and coming into the open, carrying a nervous fright of expectations. Oh, what a Friday night might offer. The moment I measure diligently, this sweaty dance floor in square feet, exacting a linear understanding of joy. Lily foaming mouth, expelling innocence in murky tides, surrounded by decibels and chemicals and spools of potential use, waiting to be whisked to a quiet place. Eyes trembling and tumbling intrepidly in various combinations of treble and bass. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noah, for loosening us up. So I'm going to talk about a GLISP that I did junior year. So this is like a project I did while I was studying abroad in Cape Town, South Africa. Because this is in Cape Town, South Africa, I have to give a little crash course on Cape Town, South Africa. So I have a lot to say. If there's stuff that doesn't make sense, please ask me after. It's going to be hard for me to cover everything. Anyway, so this is a map of Cape Town, South Africa. The dots on the map each represent 90 people of a specific racial demographic. So as you can see, it's still a lot of blocks of certain colors. It's still one of the most segregated cities in the world, even 23, it was 22 years after apartheid when I was there, now 23 years after apartheid. Yeah, so a lot of this project was contending with the divisions that are part of Cape Town, South Africa. The divisions stretch back way before apartheid. It's been like a colonial city of the Dutch and British empires since the 1800s. And apartheid was just kind of like another progression of that process. When I was living in Cape Town, I lived with 4 different families as part of the program that I was in, and each one was a different ethnic group and in a different neighborhood of the city. And there isn't very much crossover in terms of people going to different neighborhoods. So a lot of this project was just thinking about that type of division. I'm also, I think as somebody who's multiracial, I kind of idealize the idea of solidarity and allyship between different racial groups. That's also what brought me to this. So Cape Town, as a place that's divided, also has a really strong history of resistance art and art that's meant to bring different types of people together. So this is a poetry space called Zinc Poetry, and it's in Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch is known as the birthplace of apartheid. It's a stronghold for white conservative Afrikaners, but it's also actually mostly people of color. It's just starkly divided. So this poetry space was started by a bunch of people at the University of Stellenbosch, and it aims to be explicitly multi-ethnic and multilingual. When you go there, people are performing poetry in multiple languages, and they have translations written up on the wall. People will be turning to each other and like translating poems for each other if they don't understand it. And there's just a very strong spirit of sort of resilience through poetry. So I was kind of interested in this type of work and a lot of different artwork like it coming to Cape Town. So what I'm going to talk about is the idea of a place-based poetry workshop. So this project was organizing a poetry workshop that I co-facilitated with other South African poets, where we moved through different public spaces in the city and thought about how our different identities help us, how our identities bring us to experience spaces in different ways, and seeing what type of dialogue about race and history and identity and art that might bring up. So to make that happen, I basically did a lot of sort of like networking and just spending time in every single poetry open mic that I could become a part of. And I'd read my poetry and then talk to other poets. The person who was the co-facilitator with me is an organizer of an open mic in the city. Her name is Roche Kester, and was one of my best friends in the city. I also worked with a mentor that my study abroad program hooked me up with, who is a well-established poet in the city. So we went to 3 public spaces and wrote about and poetry workshopped around each of those spaces. The 3 spaces were District 6, which is a big site of forced removals in Cape Town. Has anyone seen the movie District 9? So District 9 is like loosely inspired by District 6. And District 6 is this place where there's like, it once was a really large multiracial working class neighborhood, and it was cleared to the ground during apartheid to make space for white people who wanted the land. But activism prevented people from building anything there, so now in the center of the city there's just like a big empty wasteland that you have to walk past. So yeah, it was District 6, Church Square, which is this memorial at the center of the city, sort of to South African colonialism, and Company Gardens, which is this big garden that used to serve the Dutch East India Company. So also going into the workshop, I kind of put out a call for poets and told people that if they were willing, they could submit their poetry to me at the end of the workshop, and I'd try to scaffold it into a poetry book that I put together, which I did. Yeah, so some of the questions that this brings up, I kind of view this whole thing as sort of like, just like a pilot test for more of these types of workshops in the future. So some important questions are, how can a place-based poetry workshop help participants and the wider world remap the city from a subjective, individual point of view? So Cape Town is a place that has a really strong history of colonial mapping. And mapping has often been used as a tool to divide people in Cape Town. So a lot of this project was sort of thinking about how people might map the city based on their own subjectivities. It's also, how can this type of a workshop present artists as researchers? So in what way do artists who live in a given city already have their own practices of observing critically their surroundings? And yeah, I think sort of part of what I was thinking about going into the project was like, a lot of poets do the work of, say, a social science researcher in a city, but without the degree to back it up. Yeah, and how might this facilitate dialogue in a divided post-colonial city? Yeah, okay, so sorry, content warning that just flashed on the screen. I want to read some poetry that came out of the workshop, but this was coming from Church Square, which has a memorial to slavery, and both of these poems touch on slavery and colonial violence. So the one on the left is something that I wrote when we were in the poetry workshop. The one on the right is something my friend wrote. I'm just going to read the one that I wrote because I don't feel comfortable performing the one on the right. So yeah, basically we were all at this public memorial that was a memorial to slavery. The night before, I had celebrated Passover with a bunch of people. So this was about a year ago. And Passover is this strange holiday to me in that it kind of commemorates Jewish people's history of slavery. But it was very strange to be doing that in South Africa and with this big South African Jewish population. So what I ended up writing about when we were in that place was, do they know that last night I drank to my people's freedom? Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Last night I relaxed, chains no longer on my ankles. It has been years since those days. For all I know, I've never been a slave. We Jews, we escapees turned captors. We had too much wine after Egypt. So I bolded, let my people go. Or I guess I'll give you a second to read some of this. It was by Ruby May, but so the reason I bolded the text, let my people go, is that it was one of many times during the workshop where people sort of elicited these memories that overlapped and crossed over, but were also completely different. So on the one hand, I think this illustrates the way that there was sort of like a critical dialogue going on from all of us coming together and workshopping poetry. On the other hand, I think it's a sort of honest look on the very, very different emotional stakes that I had coming into it compared to a lot of the people who were participants in the workshop. And that's something like I'd love to talk about after this if people have questions. Yeah, so the outcome of this. Yeah, so in retrospect, the workshop actually did bring a lot of people to write poems that engage critically with history, body, place, language, race. All the workshop participants, we kept in touch after and talked a lot about the workshop, and people did talk about it as a time that allowed them to sort of think critically about the relationship between body and space. Poetry book, still in the works. I've basically just been like waiting to get an illustrator to do it and got overwhelmed with my thesis and haven't been able to publish it yet. And I do think in terms of future research or future workshops, this is the type of thing that could work in a lot of different cities, and I really wish people did it. I think there is something really special and productive about getting a bunch of different artists together, walking around a place, thinking about how they relate to it, and creating art out of that. So, yeah.
Hi everyone, so I'm Stefania. I'm going to talk about my capstone, which is called The Sense of Heaven, Political Imaginary in Chicago Hip Hop. And to start off, I'm going to show a video, which is a teaser to a forthcoming video by this woman, Jamila Woods, whose album I think through and talk about in my capstone. So I hope that, I wonder if there's a sound option.
I can help.
Do you think that? Yeah. Sorry.
Is this your sound over here? This is your computer.
Sorry.
Let's just like make sure that that's what to. Oh, we probably didn't look at the sound setting.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's also like there's not that much actual. There's not much actual sound, so it's not a big deal.
Okay. Do you want me to not? I can do it or not do it. I just have to go into your settings.
Okay, you should go into the settings. It's not on the computer though. Sorry, everyone. You can take a break, drink some water, eat some food. Thank you so much.
I don't know how to use this version. How do you just get it back?
Oh, you just go.
Yeah, yeah. Let's try it.
It's fine. Mostly it's just ambient noise. Okay, so we can imagine, sorry, what the sound is. Okay, but mostly there's no like actual music, but sort of like ambient noise. I'm just gonna let you enjoy it. So basically, Jamila Woods is a goddess. So sort of the context that this project is coming out of is thinking about two deaths that happened in Chicago in the past 5 years. So the first is Rekia Boyd, who was a 22-year-old Black woman. She was shot to death on Chicago's West Side in 2012 by an off-duty Chicago police officer, who was then acquitted of all charges in 2015. And the other one, that's on the right, she's on the right. And then on the left is Laquan McDonald. He's a 17-year-old, and he was shot 16 times on the Southwest Side in 2014 by a police officer, Chicago police officer. And there was some dash cam footage of the killing that was recorded, and then it was kept from the public until after our mayor, Rahm Emanuel, had been reelected. So in the wake of these instances of state-sanctioned violence against specifically Black youth, Chicago's activist and artist communities organized around and against them. And so my project is thinking through 3 musical projects that were released in 2016 in the wake of these killings, and that sort of emerged out of those communities. And I'm thinking through how they contest the conditions of a place while also recuperating it and offering creative alternatives, imaginative resources, and spaces of liberation. So, the first project is Heaven, which was released by Jamila in 2016. So this is a quote from a song called LSD, which is Lakeshore Drive, which is a highway in Chicago, and it ends with a soundbite from a voicemail presumably left by one of Jamila's friends. And it goes, Chicagoans create this sense of heaven in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of injustice, in the midst of pain. Life goes on. That just shows our resilience. So in this part of the paper, I'm trying to look at what this sense of heaven is, which is what I read as the imaginary space that this album both creates and takes place in. It's sort of familiar and strange. You can see in the Holy teaser trailer thing that it's like, maybe it was like Jamila and other members of a community, so in that sense they're familiar, but also it's sort of in a strange place. It feels like otherworldly. So it's Chicago, it's not Chicago. It takes place both during the transatlantic slave trade and in the future when space travel is possible. So I argue that heaven operates within queer temporalities, making it what this theorist named Jose Munoz calls a queer utopic project. I also compare it to other queer utopic projects such as Jerry Moraga's Queer Aslan, wherein she queers the masculinist way that the Chicano liberation movement historically mobilized this figure of Aslan, which is the mythological homeland of the Chicano people. And the next project that I'm thinking through is a mixtape called Autumn, which was released by my friend Essie Lindsay, who goes by Lindsay, in 2016. But I'm just going to talk through another project that Essie created, which is this cipher, which is like kind of like an improvised like poetry hip hop space. But she organized it specifically for like all of her female rapper friends in the community. So I argue that Lindsay's cipher represents what this theorist Jack Halberstam calls queer archiving practices, where boundaries are blurred between archivists and producers, expert and student, senior and junior, theorist and object of analysis. So the subculture and space that this video documents I'm arguing in these ways queer, or at least moving with queer temporalities, even though I think Essie is probably the only like out lesbian in this group of people. And then the third project that I'm thinking through is an album called Telephone by Fatima Warner, who also goes by No Name. It was released in 2016. So this quote is the end of the hook in the song Forever. And so she says, they ain't trying to me shine, but on my time, fuck it, I'll live forever now. So I'm reading this album as No Name's response to Black women's historical erasure from the canon and the archive. I think she's both challenging and employing what this other theorist, Evelyn Hammond, calls the notion of the invisible, that Black women writers have used to describe aspects of Black women's lives and sexuality. I think No Name inserts the specificity of herself without the specificity of her name by calling herself No Name into the canon of popular culture, music, and literature. In this way, she both intervenes and resists assimilation into normative modes of history and historicity. So, these are some questions I had that sort of framed my capstone. So, how do these projects disidentify with the communities in the state? So, like thinking through how are these projects about Chicago and also not about Chicago? How do they like celebrate a place and also contest it? How are these projects queer and not gay? So I thought through like about queer archiving practices, how queer temporalities are represented and created. And I specified like not gay, so like I don't know if all of the people that I'm like looking at are like actually identify as gay, but the way that they like their musical projects are sort of are queering something sort of as a verb, not necessarily as an identity. And then my third question is, in what ways do these projects create new worlds and temporalities? So that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, I'm Sofia. And so I'm a junior, so I have little to nothing written yet, but I have a lot of ideas. So it'll be really good to present them to you here so I can get feedback and learn more about what I'm going to write about. So right now, my working title is Reconstructions of the Past and the Present for the Future, the Music and Videos of M. Lamar. So I'll give a little background on M. Lamar. He is a artist. He's an operatic singer. He is Laverne Cox's twin sibling, and self-defines as having a Negro Gothic aesthetic. His words, not mine, and really explores how the past can be brought into the present through performance, through art, and through embodiment. So I came to this topic because I had a lot of ideas about writing around queerness and writing around race and writing around the past. And when I watched his videos for the first time, it really brought it into sharp focus, that this was something that I really wanted to delve into and to examine critically. So I'm not going to play the video because you do have to hear it, and I think it's very heavy for right now because the sonic field is like deep and intense and really interesting to examine, but y'all should look it up on your own time. So basically what I'm trying to do in this topic is think a lot about history and the past and how we can contextualize it through art and performance as an alternative archive. So thinking about art and performance as an alternative archive to understand the past. So in a 2013 interview, M. Lamar quoted James Baldwin, who wrote, "History is not something we read about in books. History isn't even the past, it is the present." So I'm really trying to frame my thesis with that quote. And thinking about some central questions, which are on this slide, which are: how can slavery be understood transhistorically? How can operatic vocal techniques be understood in relation to the history of slavery? What is freedom? What can M. Lamar tell us about the past? And how does he do it? And then what is understood to constitute an archive? So obviously I'm in the beginning stages because this is like a lot, but what I'm hoping to do is to think about the myths of white supremacy that tell us that the past is no longer here, and that not only are we in a like colorblind society, but that we are fully free from the past. And in doing this, I'm really thinking about my positionality as a white Latina and what do I feel comfortable writing about, and thinking also about negotiating how to come to writing about slavery as a white Latina, and also as somebody who has no background in opera. So I think that might be a strength because I'm really trying to argue for the affective resonance of that kind of singing more than actually knowing things about opera. And so to do this, I'm putting M. Lamar in conversation with a few other people, including Janelle Monáe, to think about kind of having alter egos and the line between performer and person, and also to think about two specific videos of her, two specific Janelle Monáe videos, Many Moons and Tightrope, to think about how kind of Afrofuturism is related to the past, and really also to deep histories, and how maybe M. Lamar is not Afrofuturist but Afropastist, still coming up with a good term, but thinking about what use that serves. And then also thinking about Abby Lincoln's triptych Prayer, Protest, and Peace with Max Roach, which is really going to be my entry point to think about affective resonance of screaming and singing and operatic sound, and what are the lines between screaming and opera, and this is where my untrained ear will probably come in handy, and also to understand how the scream that both Lincoln and Lamar are performing, and also sometimes Monet, is really related to the history of anti-Black violence in the US. So I think this thesis is important because it also intervenes in a history that is very understudied, which is Black opera. And I actually have been researching for a little while on this, and I've found about 3 sources that talk about Black opera, and they're all very short. So I think it'll be really interesting to try to make something up from very little, especially not having an ethnomusicology background. So that's kind of what I'm exploring. And I'm also thinking a lot about freedom. I'm in this really wonderful class this semester with Professor Emily Owens, and in her work, she really troubles the line between, she really troubles what freedom means, especially when it's always put in kind of a binary relationship with slavery. And so I'm thinking about what does freedom mean in performance in the contemporary moment, specifically dealing with anti-Black violence. And I'm also thinking about aesthetics, because M. Lamar has really interesting aesthetics and really Gothic aesthetics that have a lot to do with both the Academy, performance art, opera, death, and the past, and sex. So I'm kind of trying to understand how all of this locks in to provide a different reading of the past, and also to center these coffins that M. Lamar talks about. He talks about people carrying coffins through generations and generations on their back, and the weight of years and years of holding coffins every single moment of every single day. So exploring how to carry those coffins in this kind of creative way that he's putting forwards in his performances and also in his daily life, because this is how he moves through the world. He dresses like this every day. He is that's kind of another thing that I'm running into, what is the line between person and performer, and how can I actually draw the line, and is it important to draw the line? So that kind of brings me to the things that I'm struggling with, that I haven't quite figured out how to include in my thesis cleanly, which is M. Lamar's prison abolitionist politics that he references in interviews. But I'm not really sure how or where to read that onto his performance yet. And I'm also going to be writing about gender in this essay and thinking a lot about Hortense Spiller's idea of ungendering and M. Lamar's kind of taking up of that. And he talks a lot about how people always want him to be trans and always want him to be gender nonconforming, but he really identifies solidly as a man. And so I think it's a really interesting point to think and write about, to understand gender more fully. And then, but I'm also not sure where it's going to fit in yet. And then I also am trying to figure out what kind of future there is in a Gothic past, and how can you kind of read Afrofuturist ideals onto these pasts that are really divorced from Afrofuturism. So that's what I'm thinking about. I'm really looking forward to feedback, and I know I said a lot, but I have nothing written, so it'll be really formative for my thesis to hear everything that y'all are thinking about. And I'll go back to the first slide. Thank you.
Excellent. Great job. So we're going to do, we have some framing questions here, and we're also going to take questions from the audience. Just going to ask the group, would you like to start with the framing questions or questions from the audience? Why don't we start with some framing questions, and then it might stimulate questions. So I'll start with the first one, and then you can all feel free to jump in. whenever you want. So, and the panel came up with these framing questions, so again, feel free to add in any other questions you have from the audience. We'll start with, what role does movement, and including migration, motion, social movements, etc., play in your projects?
I guess I can start. Obviously, these, like the 4 novels I worked with stem from a place of movement, their parents' migration to a new space. Beyond that, I think the individual novels are very concerned with movement. Every protagonist is constantly moving to different spaces, negotiating different spaces. And then I also think that there's this interesting gesture towards dance, which maybe will lead to Noah's work well, but the way that dance itself becomes a way to encode history, I think, is interesting in When the Spirits Dance Mambo, and the way that these artistic movements become ways that we need to, I guess, remember and correct the archive, maybe.
Yeah, I'm thinking about dance. Just like the way that a dance floor almost becomes metonymic for like the motion of the people in that space carries like so many more histories beyond that floor. Like when you're in a space and dancing with a group of strangers and friends, a mix that you might never encounter again on another night in that same combination with the same music, people are bringing into that space their own histories of like where they've danced before, who they've danced with, and also like where their body has been, what their body has faced. So it's just really interesting to me to think about how when I am in a space and I'm responding to the other bodies that are in that space, it really is a unique relationship, and it's really like this transfer of, through emotion, of like larger and fuller histories.
And I just want to say one thing that I found interesting, if I can find my notes here, is the kind of how you brought together people kind of who are removed by place and time, or space and time, and or not removed by space and time. So, and I was also thinking about permanence versus impermanence when you're talking about, you know, dancing is somewhat, especially in that setting, is kind of in the moment, very much in the moment, whereas poetry could also be in the moment, but it's also preserved in many cases, depending on if it's published or not, but or if it's shared. So. I don't know if you have any, you can add or not add to that if you want.
I think you said it really brilliantly.
Are we going this way? Is that okay? Yeah, I'm gonna take that question a lot more literally. I think my project is like very much about literally moving our bodies through space and reflecting on that. One of the things that one of the participants said after the workshop is that a common practice for a lot of writers is going on a morning walk. And I think that when you're moving through any urban space that's very racialized, and that's like where space and race are so intertwined, that takes on like an entirely new meaning. And I think that's very much what my project was about.
Yeah, so I'm thinking a lot about what you said about social movements. I think the projects I'm looking at emerge out of social movements, emerged out of collective movements specifically. I think like the reason why it's like art is so amazing is because it can embody like a multitude of times. It can speak about narratives that happened across like hundreds of years. I think that's why art is like sort of an inherently queer thing to think about. And then also my project stays in one place. It's looking at one place specifically, and like why and how people don't leave that place. Because I think specifically like No Name is like kind of a household name now, and she got so famous she could probably move away, but she's chosen not to. And what does that mean? And why is that important to her art?
So the way that I'm thinking about movement is movement through time, and thinking about time as not necessarily a linear space, but more of a feeling space, and thinking about how memory can be proof, and thinking about how memory and feelings can be markers in kind of the movement of time. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about movement.
Great. One of the things I was really curious with a few people, and Sophia, you mentioned it more for the future in terms of your own positionality and your own identities. So I'd love to hear how the panelists, how your identities play into your work. In particular, I'm interested in all of them, but it just struck me in terms of Sam, and you just kind of alluded to it now, and also when you did your presentation about, how segregated Cape Town is, and what I'm interested in what your experience was moving through those different spaces.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like as somebody who's multiracial and white passing, I think in terms of how I was perceived, especially as an American in Cape Town, the fact that I'm like multiracial is pretty irrelevant. It was basically I was being read as like a white body in whatever space I was in. Yeah, I guess I'd say one thing that I think was really important and kind of like not really a good thing about what happened during the workshop was that there was a miscommunication with my co-facilitator at one point, where we had kind of met in the week beforehand to plan out how to do this. And I think there are all these parallels of dealing with this like really emotionally heavy topic of literally walking through space in Cape Town, but it's like extremely, extremely loaded, and had kind of gone specifically through every single prompt that we were gonna do and what we were gonna do at different times. And Roche ended up, I guess, coming up with some prompts on her own that we didn't actually go over beforehand. And things kind of got botched when we were in Church Square, and like basically the stuff that came out of the poetry that I was reading up there. And I think so some participants found it extremely jarring to be going through that space and like having these memories brought up. So kind of built into the workshop, we like ended up spending a lot of time just like hanging out in a park nearby and cooling off. And I guess, which is to say that like with anything like this, I still haven't found a way of doing, or like when I did it, I don't think I found a way to do it in a way that wasn't kind of scary and didn't bring up a lot of problems, and I'm still trying to figure out an answer to that question. So, like, I think if I was to do this again, it would take a lot of, just based on like the experiences that I had that time, like a whole nother round of sort of planning and reflecting. I don't know.
Thanks. Do others want to share about their own identities and how it influenced your work?
I can share. I'm just becoming more and more conscious as I think about the past, that there are some things that I just don't feel comfortable writing about in my thesis as a white person. And so I'm also being really conscious of like following in Saidiya Hartman's footsteps and not wanting to write about like kind of explicit scenes of violence, to not recreate them. So I'm trying to be really mindful in that sense, and be really conscious of the history that I am writing about, and how much easier it might be for me as a white person to write about how present in these performances the history of slavery is. So I think I'm definitely entering it trying to be very cognizant of my identities.
For me too, I chose to write about the people because they were like part of my community growing up, and like Jamil has been a mentor to me, a friend, a boss. Like Essie and I like competed together in like spoken word tournaments, and like I watched No Name sort of like get to where she was in like really intimate spaces. And I think like as somebody who's part of the academy, I really wanted to sort of lend the legibility of academia to these projects that I knew on an emotional level and a personal level were really important. That being said, obviously I'm a white woman talking about like 3 Black women, and I know that I'm not necessarily the right person to be like talking about that, and maybe I'm not the right person for this project, but it felt like something I wanted to do like on a personal level for these friends. So I don't know, it's something I'm thinking about all the time.
Something that I was consciousness as I was sort of navigating archives of Nightlife, including literary and other sorts of archives, is the fact that the history of Nightlife has been very whitewashed, and that particular queer nightlife, and that important seminal moments like, for instance, the Stonewall riots was a insurrection that was primarily led by queer and trans Latinx and Black people. And likewise, a lot of musical movements that have become like very popular now, like house and techno, were created by primarily Black queer communities in Chicago and Detroit, respectively, before they sort of became like very taken up in sort of mainstream spaces, especially in Europe. So that's just like a history that was really interesting to negotiate and navigate and like learn about, and to think about in relation to the subject positionalities of the writers that I was reading as well as my own. And that also led me to really think about like how in my own project I could quote writers and really try to create something that was polyphonous, reflecting the number of different experiences and narratives that happen in a dance floor rather than like a single authoritative narrative as if there's only one experience.
Yeah, I guess I echo a lot of what's already been said. I think, for one thing, by working with these particular literary texts, obviously I'm examining these specific experiences. Something I did have to work a lot and was really careful about was what brought me to this topic was an interest in sort of like Latinx experience in general in the United States, given like the current political situation. I wanted a chance, even though I majored in comparative literature, to sort of look at those questions. But I only wrote about Nuyorican text, and I used the term Nuyorican rather than Puerto Rican. So it was really something I had to be very conscious of, was not conflating identities that, while I think share a lot, like Dominicans in New York and Puerto Ricans in New York, I had to be very careful with that. I also, like when I studied abroad in Paris, I did go to a school that was sort of on the edge of the Banlieue in Paris. So these are identities that I have proximity with, even if I don't fully embody myself. I didn't grow up in New York. I grew up in Puerto Rico and then in Colorado. So I think being aware of the terms I was using was something I had to be really careful throughout my text. Yeah.
Do you have some questions for each other? Or do you want to go to the audience?
I was going to actually add one thing in relation to what Noah was saying. I can't even remember what of the many points you brought up made me think of this. But yeah, I think also for me, thinking about like my positionality in South Africa, part of the intentionality behind me doing a poetry workshop rather than any other type of thing that I could be doing was to do something that was like sort of less extractive and where I kind of gave up control of what was going on. And the importance, like the distinction between like facilitating a workshop versus say like teaching is that as a workshop facilitator and like one of two workshop facilitators, all I was really doing was sort of like giving people prompts and then just writing with people, and it ended up just being like a lot of different people writing together. So in that way, I was hoping to spend my energies more like creating a platform for everybody, and also writing rather than sort of like writing about other people. And I think that helped for me. But no questions.
We have some more here, but do we want to go to the audience? And does anybody have any questions they would like to ask?
I have a question about suppressed identities and maybe closets, and how that, in contrast to the queer nightclub, how poetry in the closet can or how emotions that we don't want displayed can find their way, I guess even in like across racial lines. I find that sometimes with people who have interracial experiences, like, you can end up quieting one part when you're around these others. And I wonder how this, like if you find any clues in your poetry of maybe suppressed or hidden experience.
Ooh, I really like that question. Thank you so much. So something that I'm thinking about in relationship to like closeted identities is like the ways that queer nightlife spaces have often been presented as sort of like haven or sanctuary spaces to like try out an identity or like to explore an identity away from like governing eyes. And so that's sort of like a narrative that I think has come to the fore a lot of the time. Like nightlife is a space that anyone can just go to and have a really great time and have their own like joy of releasing their identity into the open. And I think that the idea of like closeted identities or uncomfortable experiences is something that is a really important voice and series of voices that contradict that narrative of utopian sanctuary in nightlife. Like physical assault happens in nightlife scenarios. Racism exists in queer nightlife spaces. There's a lot of like underlying tensions and frictions that aren't necessarily highlighted all the time in the most popular narratives about queer nightlife. So I really appreciated you're like highlighting one of like those layers.
Yeah, I think that all of the texts that I worked out are really looking at this. I think something that I didn't really bring up was that all of these, especially the Nuyorican authors, are racialized as Black, and they insist on their self-identifying as Puerto Rican, and I wish I had more space to talk about is sort of the nuances of code switching based on what spaces they're occupying. I think that suppressed identities is something that is very much something that they're concerned with, and I think it keys into sort of these notions of strategic essentialism in a time when identifying as Black or African was more dangerous, because especially with Piri Tomas, he travels to the South like during Jim Crow is one of the moments in the biography. So I think closeted identities and this notion of safeness is something really central here.
I've also recently been thinking about like in like queer theory sort of retroactively fitting my current frameworks about like queerness and like coming out upon texts and like maybe figures who wouldn't identify that way themselves, and like is that like a recuperative sort of mechanism, or is that like me like doing something that like somebody did not consent to? You know what I mean? Like it's just like, I don't know, I think about consent in those kinds of conversations. And yeah, so like what good is that really doing when somebody didn't really identify that way themselves? It's interesting.
I think for my thesis, it might be really interesting to think of, instead of a closet, a coffin, and to think about what's hidden, what kind of identities, what kind of realities and lives are hidden in that kind of space of the past. So thank you for that. I think I'm going to roll with that.
And I think, also in kind of thinking about some of the framing questions, we were thinking about the trauma that gets carried from generation to generation, which seems, I think it's a thread throughout all of your presentations, and will be a thread potentially, Sofia, with the coffin, the symbolism of the coffin.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And it's something that I'm trying to also figure out, because I think inherited trauma or embodied trauma or like inherited violence is something that is not written about very much in the academy. It's in what I have found. So if anyone has a great source, please come and talk to me after. But I think it's a really difficult thing to like give proof for, like to find proof of. And so I think it's a really important, it's a really important reality to draw more attention towards. So I'm really trying to think about memory as proof, and kind of like feelings as proof of the past. So I think inherited trauma, especially inherited trauma from slavery, is like a central piece of my work and my thesis, to think about also how in Lamar's work is that shown or hidden, or like he talks about it all the time in his interviews. And so I'm really trying to think through in the work, how do you read it, not just in the person. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think like something I'd be interested in hearing from you guys is like, what's the role of art, I guess, in documenting these traumas? I know something that the last book I work with deals with is so much the erasure of this massacre that resulted in the death of 200 Algerians in Paris, and is one of the largest massacres in Western European history, and it's not really talked about. And so there are these erasures of state violence, and what's the role of art, I guess, in documenting and continuing these memorialization and mourning.
Yeah, I think with my project, it was a lot of thinking about, in relation to that, what is the violence of a map, and how maps like draw these lines in cities, and then sort of, powerful people can make maps and then just make them into a type of reality that moves people and displaces people. So yeah, the idea behind the work that I was doing was, what happens if you try to remap things based on people's subjectivities and based on people's memories? And like, what does it mean when a group of people walks through a city space that has been mapped as like, oh, this is like a downtown business district. But instead of writing about it as such, it's all of a sudden written as like, well, this is actually a place that stores a lot of memories for me, and how that's an important truth. Yeah.
Other questions?
I have a question about going off of that last conversation. Oh, thank you. Sorry. I have a question going off of that last conversation about the sort of like the balance between rendering those sort of like invisibilized histories legible to like a larger audience, while also avoiding the sort of like the re-violence of like asking people to negotiate those like intergenerational trauma, and how you've all sort of dealt with that divide, especially in like the context of the conversation about positionality as well.
One thing I'm thinking about in my paper, well, there's Evelyn Hammond who talks about like sort of the shape of history and the shape of history's silences, and how like we can't like, even if we don't know what's inside the silences, just sort of like honoring their like circumference as a way not to like you said, kind of like rehash those violences and recreate them. I think that's like a tricky balance to walk, and it's like, that's just like an idea. I don't know how it like happens in the paper, but I think it's good to try.
What do you mean by circumferences?
Like she thinks of this idea of black holes, so like the silences of Black women's sexuality and like the archive, like what isn't there about it, but what sort of like hints at it and suggests at it. Like that's the framework through which it's like most productive to think about it.
I think for my project, I honestly don't have a really good answer yet, because Lamar's music is so, it is very heavy and almost violent listening to it, especially because because I don't particularly enjoy opera, like when I listen to it, it's really like hearing screaming, and it's like, really I think an physical kind of listening that is required. And so I think that it's something that I'm still personally trying to figure out exactly, but I do think that that I know that in my project, at least, I'm definitely not going to be imposing anything. I'm going to try to stay as much within the realm of like what has been said as possible, because I really don't want to put like my own ideas of what M. Lamar is experiencing onto M. Lamar. So I know that I'm trying to really use what he says in interviews to frame how I'm understanding his work.
Yeah, and I would say for my project, yeah, so like the way that came, like, would naturally come into play is like going to a place where people have a lot of people with different identities have extremely different experiences and traumatic memories that are brought up by being there. I think before the workshop even happened, I tried to give people a very clear idea of where we were going and what we were doing. And a lot of the traumatic memories that were brought up were very connected to those places. So it's like, we're gonna go to District 6 and write about it. Is this something that you're interested in doing? That being said, I think a tremendous amount of care needs to be put into how that workshop goes, like when you're actually in a place. And like I said, I think for the most part, that was done with care, but there was a moment when I think it wasn't, and I think a lot of traumatic memories were brought up that shouldn't have been. Yeah, so I don't have like a perfect answer to it, but.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would actually love to respond
Yeah,
to that
sure,
as
sure,
well.
sure.
I think that's a really great question. I think, first of all, the last text that I work with, the one about this specific moment in history, is itself very much concerned with it. It's like 100 pages, and there's an English translation. So if you want to read it, it's very quick read. And the characters themselves are trying to reconstruct this history of this episode of violence that their parents have refused to sort of tell them. And so I think it's interesting, that initial reluctance on the family to share the history and sort of the weird avenues that they have to go through in order to be able to recuperate that history for themselves. So I think they have to turn to sort of like academia and sites of memory in the city, and they rewrite those sites to represent their histories that were erased. And so I think that's something that's really interesting. Another example is just the term Beur, originally the French term for second generation North African migrants. It was originally sort of like a derogatory term that's been reappropriated through slang. But I had to be very careful in using that term in my thesis. So the result of that and the way that I had to be sure to use that carefully was spent about 10 pages in my introduction justifying the use of this term, not as anything that limits these identities, but something that is useful for comparison, but being very much aware that these are loaded terms, and I think acknowledging that in my work right at the beginning was essential. Otherwise, I could not have had it in my title. Yeah.
It's really interesting about reclaiming something versus causing trauma related to that. This is just a little historical fact that some students may or may not know about. In terms of when I was young and coming out, before the rainbow flag was a thing, it existed, but it wasn't a main symbol. A pink triangle was like a really powerful reclaimed symbol from Nazi Germany. Gay men wore pink triangles in concentration camps. But there were still many concentration camp survivors alive as this was being reclaimed. And Leslie Ann Newman, who is a Jewish-American writer, wrote a series of short stories, and I'm going to forget the name of the book. I think it's called... if anybody's interested, I think it's a really great collection of short stories. But one of the stories is about the trauma that a survivor experienced by seeing the pink triangle reclaimed, and for many ways, the pink triangle wasn't the right symbol, probably for a more broad symbol, and I think that's why it didn't stick. But it just reminded me of that, of how taking something that you think is empowering and reclaiming it can also cause trauma to others, and how do you figure that out? anyway. Other questions? We have a little bit more time if we want to continue. Do you want to take any of the questions that you had, or whenever? Or would you feel you want to wrap it up? Either way, it's fine.
I think one thing that we didn't get to touch on in each of our projects is the different ways that we're thinking about history, and like what counts as history and what counts as an archive, and also like what counts as proof. So I'm just like, for my own personal work, I'd love to know more about what y'all think counts as history and as proof, and how you deal with that in writing academic work.
Also, I just remember, was it last night that Noah was saying that like maybe none of these projects would be possible like 30 years ago. So I think, yeah, something interesting to think about is like what is also like a legitimate object of study in relation to all of that.
And I definitely think that's still an issue for a lot of people doing research, particularly, in a more quote unquote traditional like PhD program or something, what's considered valid, and can you find advisors and those kinds of things.
Yeah, which I think is like a huge problem. And also we're really lucky that we're undergraduates writing these, because I don't think we would get away with it even maybe at another university.
Yeah, I guess I'll talk about, I think having written a thesis, there was, in a department that is comparative literature, there was definitely some interesting balances that I had to do, and I definitely, my last week of sort of editing was a little rough, because I was told that some of my historical sources weren't sufficiently academic, and so I was sort of frantically finding sufficiently academic sources, and I think it's challenging, but I think what is really great is that by studying literature, I can use these texts as sort of an example of these historical moments, and I think that by studying them through a literary framework, it did allow me to have more leeway than someone who's coming at these texts from like a history concentrator would have written a very different thesis if they used these exact four texts. So I think I had some freedoms, but there were also some limitations as well.
Yeah, one thing I forgot to mention in how I came to this thesis was that I submitted an essay on Lamar on one music video, theorizing. Anyways, I was doing it for a history class, and I went in, and my history professor was like, "This is like a cool essay, but this isn't history, and like you're making your claims." And it was like in a really nice and helpful way, and actually like gave me my thesis. But it was definitely like a moment where I was like, "Oh, like what counts as history in cultural studies is actually not what historians think is history at all," and how to negotiate. What a historian thinks of as history in the way that I'm kind of trying to think about history is a really kind of tricky balance.
In many ways, my project is like trans-historic, or it doesn't really abide by any sort of like linear historical rules either. And as you sort of noted in that term, like cultural studies, using literary objects from like different times and places without like context can of like those particular moments can really take things, throw it out of the loop, or queer it, I guess. And that was a risk I was willing to take, because I think what was interesting to me was just to see an intergenerational dialogue, which I think is a very particularly queer space of history and oral story making and world making, insofar that that those lines that are crossed across history make new stories, and there's collaboration and community that exists in that listening space, in that riffing off of a line that you see in another poem, in that space of retelling a story and passing on knowledges that might be forgotten elsewise.
Yeah, I'll be honest with my project. I'm not sure that I would moving forward with future iterations of this type of work, like I don't think the best place is academia for it. Academia was sort of like the thing that gave me the time and the privilege to do it and get support for doing it. But I had to put a tremendous amount of effort. So I was just talking about like this poetry book part of it, but then there's also this whole nother thing that I did where I just wrote like a 50-page research paper analyzing everything that I did. But I haven't been talking about that because it's like less interesting to me, and also it's like because I had to spend so much time and energy doing that, like that poetry book never actually got published. So at the same time, like that is where the resources came from for doing it. But I do think there's an aspect of it where it's like this should be directed at like artists and the relevant communities more than academia, and I'm not sure how to like toe that line yet. But yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Let's just one more round of applause.